So Glenn, we are very happy to see you here for this recording for the birthday of His Holiness, which will be celebrated on the 6th of July. And I would like to ask my first question. What is your connection with His Holiness? When did you meet him? How did you meet him? How often did you see him? And so on. Could you please tell us a few words about it?
Spasiba. My mother was a British war bride. I grew up in a small town on the east coast of Canada. And my mother was a war bride from London. And she was connected to the Theosophical Society, a sort of international society started by a Russian woman, Madame Blavatsky, who kind of introduced, you could say, Tibetan Buddhism to the West, because being Russian, of course, East Russia in Tsarist days was Lama Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, with the Buryat and Siberia, Tuva, and even in the West, Kalmuk. So strong influence. So I, from teenage years, started reading books on Tibet and Asia, India, China, so on. Mostly philosophical, spiritual books as opposed to history or, I don't know, cultural books, more spiritual books, you could say, the great classics. And the first time I saw the name Dalai Lama in a book, I was maybe 14 or 15 years old. It was a little bit like touching an electric socket. It went bzzz. Had very, very strong impact on me. So at that time, I knew I had some sort of karmic connection. But at those days, there was nothing by any Dalai Lama in English, no teaching, no books or so on. Just some stories in magazines and references in different books about Tibet. And of course, Blavatsky mentions him, and the other early Theosophists were very interested in the Dalai Lama, the Panchen Lama. Those were kind of their two main great lamas that they saw as very inspiring. But then, after college, I went to England to meet my mom's side of the family. And while there, I met some young students from Indiana, University of Indiana, I think in Bloomington, where Dalai Lama's older brother, Taksay Rinpoche, had been teaching for about 20 years, probably. After coming into exile in India, he was given a job as a professor. And very wonderful Lama. But anyway, I'd never met him. But these 6 young boys mentioned they were studying with him and were doing a 3-month intensive in Dharamsala, and the Dalai Lama was opening a school for Western people there. And at the time I was in London. So I saved my pennies and farthings and shillings and halfpennies and made a plan to go to Dharamsala to check out the school being opened by Dalai Lama. And I traveled there in the spring of 1972 and arrived in Dharamsala in early July. Pretty well, you could say, close to Dalai Lama's birthday, not his actual birthday, but just after his birthday. And at that time, Dalai Lama would give public audience to Westerners twice a week, Monday and Friday. Not every week, but if there was a list of people who were passing through town who wanted to meet with him. So naturally, as soon as I could, I registered to attend one of those. And it was very, very memorable meeting for me. And of course, I was very excited about it because I had read about him and had a great positive feeling, you could say. But I wasn't at all prepared for the kind of just pure presence and pure energy of Dalai Lama. Because when he walked out, I remember reading in a poem once this expression, mi senge, that a living Buddha walks like a lion. And when he walked out, he just kind of had that kind of, immediately that sentence came back in my mind of the way he walked. It was at once very soft and delicate, but at the other time, just like the power of a lion. And he looked and he gave us the most sort of delightful smile. And people immediately, everyone's sort of standing a little bit like this because he's walking out, and in India, that's what people do. But the minute he smiled, everyone's backs just straightened up, and everyone was lifted about 2 or 3 inches off the ground, I think. And then Dalai Lama came in front of us and looked at us, and then he said, he often would start just by saying, "Any questions?" I think those early meetings with Western people, he was really trying to try to get a grip, I think, on what were the spiritual interests of Western people. What was the difference between, say, Western people's spiritual interest and traditional Tibetan Mongolian spiritual interest? And everyone, when we were down below coming up, everyone down below had sort of made up a question in their mind to ask. But then when he said any questions, everyone's mind just went blank. Because his presence was kind of so intense. It was a little bit like being in grade 1 at school or something like that, when the teacher says any questions and everyone just kind of froze. And so eventually I said, "Oh, I'll ask a question," because nobody said anything. So I asked him. And then Dalai Lama looked at me and he sort of stretched. And he's not a big man. I don't know how tall he is, maybe, 5'4" or 5'6" or something like that. So he's not a tall man. But suddenly he stretched and he became like 2.5 meters in my mind. It was just like his whole body changed. And I had read in Tantric Buddhist texts at that time, I had read, the translations of the classical books published by Oxford University in the 1920s, 1930s, translated by Dawa Kaze Sandop and edited by Evans Wentz, which had Tibetan Book of the Dead and Tibetan Yogas and Secret Doctrines, Life of Milarepa, Tibetan Book of Liberation, and so forth. And they talk a lot about, Tantra talks a lot about the illusory body. How the body is pure energy, and the way we experience it is very flexible, for want of a better word. In other words, 10 people looking at a physical thing will see it quite differently, depending on their connection to the pure energy level of that phenomena. So I think I was the only one who seemed to notice that the Dalai Lama went from like 1.75 meters to 2.5 meters in height. And then he looked at me and it just started. So then I said, with my question, I said, well, I've really come here to study I'm very interested in the Enlightenment traditions. I'm not interested in philosophy or religion or anything like that. I'm really only interested in enlightenment. So is it still possible? So this was I planned this question before coming. So obviously, watching the Dalai Lama's presence transform in that way, my question was already answered. But anyway, I had to say something because he was looking at me. And then Dalai Lama laughed and he says, yes, very possible, still very possible. And he says, on this mountain, many great lamas. You can check with them. They'll say the same thing. very possible. And then I said, oh, they'll talk about Milarepa and achieving enlightenment one lifetime. Are there still like Milarepas? He said, oh, even more easy now, even more easy. In time of Milarepa, enlightenment was quite difficult because Buddhism was a little bit weak still. But now we have so many great masters, so even more easy. So it was a wonderful first meeting. And so I was very fortunate that everyone else just kind of froze when they said any questions. Otherwise, probably I never would have gotten my question in once it started. And then Gyalwa Rinpoche said, anyway, Dalai Lama said, anyway, I've opened this program down at Tibetan Library and appointed a Lama to teach to Western people. And also one other Lama, Geshe Rebten, living up the mountain. I've asked him to teach Western people. So you can visit them, meet them, and see if you have some connection. And also other great Lamas living in Dharamsala at the moment. And you can check with them and see if you can connect. So that was my first meeting with Dalai Lama. And we have an expression in English, knocked my socks off. When you meet, something happens that's so powerful, it makes you jump so fast and so high that your socks fall off. So it's a very wonderful meeting. And, it was in a group of maybe 20 people or 25 people. But I think most wonderful thing about Dalai Lama is he always has the ability to give everyone who meets him the sense that they are the most important person in his life. His ability to look at everyone with that sense of intimacy and direct connection, I suppose. Almost as if, there's just the two of you on some desert island with nobody else and nothing else. Something like that. But so very, very wonderful. And then in the next weeks, I went to meet Geshe Darge and Geshe Rebten. And they were both very, very wonderful. Geshe Darge had just finished one 3-year retreat and had come to Dharamsala to ask Dalai Lama for some blessing pills for his second 3-year retreat. And Dalai Lama said, well, actually, I've got another plan for you. And appointed him to be a teacher for Western people, to run a course teaching 2 or 3 times a day, every day, 6 days a week. And then Geshe Rebten had just finished a 6-year retreat and was considered one of the great Milarepa style yogis, very strong on 6 yogas of Naropa and Niguma, these lineages. And again, very, very powerful presence. I suppose what most amazed me about, and with the 2 Ling Rinpoche, the 2 Yungzin, the Dalai Lama's 2 gurus, Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, I guess what most impressed me about these 5 first Lamas I met was their presence was at once very humble and very gentle, but at the same time, very, very powerful and overwhelmingly confident. And so it's sort of the perfect combination of innocence and wisdom, of complete tenderness with complete confidence or complete strength. And so then and at that time, Dalai Lama said, well, the program isn't starting till September and it's monsoon here. So if there's something else you want to do first, you should do it, then be back in September to start the program. So I started in September 1972 in the formal training after meeting those 5 great Lamas. And at first I thought I would just study for 3 years and be enlightened, but 3 years came and went, and I felt a great benefit and great passion for the Dharma. and for the training, but I could see that I had only scratched the surface. So 3 years became 6, and 6 became 9, 9 became 12. And after 12 years, I still would have stayed to study, but I had to go to Canada for some paperwork for a month or so. And when I was out of the country, Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, was assassinated. And the sponsors of her assassination were Indians living in Canada who were Canadian citizens. And the Indian government asked the Canada government to return them to India. But Canada has a law. We cannot just pick up a Canadian citizen and deport them without the evidence for their crime being presented. And India didn't want to present that evidence because it would have meant showing that they were spying on Canadian citizens. So it put India in an awkward position. And secondly, Canada has a policy: we cannot deport anyone for a crime that has a punishment of death sentence to a country that can give the death sentence. And so for that reason, around the world, sometimes when people get arrested, get charged, they don't get arrested, but there's a warrant out for their arrest for some crime carrying death sentence. So sometimes they'll run to Canada and give themselves up so they can spend the rest of their life in a luxurious Canadian prison, watching Canadian TV and taking courses in getting their university degree and so forth. So I couldn't go back at that time. It took about a year before I could go back, before Canadians were allowed to visit India easily again. And I continued going back for about 6 months a year for another 6 or 7 years, 8 years, whenever Dalai Lama would give main teachings, and also to do some retreat and to visit my other great gurus. Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche at that time had both passed away, but after Ling Rinpoche passed away, I mainly looked to Dhamma Lobcho Rinpoche, his great disciple, as my kind of practice guide, my Sawe Lama. Of course, Dalai Lama also my Sawe Lama, because in a kind of a personal, practical way, Dalai Lama has tens of thousands of students, you could say, and peoples who come to him. So one doesn't like to, I didn't feel comfortable asking Dalai Lama for every private little practice issue that came up. So I go back to attend Dalai Lama public teachings. And in terms of how many times I met him, in early days in Dharamsala, we could meet Monday and Friday afternoons. He gave public audiences, generally throughout spring and autumn. Monsoon maybe just once a month or something, and winter usually not, unless, because Dharamsala was quite cold in winter, and often lamas and many people would go away. So I don't know, in those I probably met for 30, 40, 50 times. And after I started writing and publishing, then Tibetans in olden days, with Tibetans, translator, they use the word Lotsawa. So it's sort of kind of equivalent to a lama. So Marpa Lotsawa is also called Lama Marpa, and Bari Lotsawa is also called Lama Bari Lama, and so on. And so they show great deference to people writing and translating and publishing. So then whenever I was working on a text, I would always request 1 or 2 private audiences with Gyalwar Rinpoche. And until he got Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, his schedule in Dharamsala wasn't so overwhelmingly busy. I mean, of course, he's still doing the work of like 10 ordinary people, but after he got the Nobel Peace Prize, and he had to start working like 100 people. But so during those days, and also I would make a little bit extra money by writing articles for Western magazines and newspapers. And so sometimes I would get a request to do an interview with Gyalwar Rinpoche, with the Dalai Lama, on some issue of political importance, or Dalai Lama's attitudes on anything from environment to health issues and things like this. And those magazines would pay me a little bit to do those interviews. And from my side, that would help me in my translation work, but also would help me to give me opportunity to spend half hour, 1 hour like that privately with Dalai Lama, and in a sort of one-on-one situation. So in that capacity, I probably met him, I don't know, 10 or 20 times, just one-on-one. And in group audiences, I don't know, between 30, 20, and 50 times, something like that. And in terms of public teachings, during all those early years in Dharamsala, Dalai Lama generally gave 3 teachings a year that were quite substantial, 6 hours a day, 5, 6 hours a day for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So he would do one like that usually in March in Dharamsala. And often he would do one in early autumn for a week or 10 days. And then usually he would either go to Bodh Gaya or Sarnath with the whole lamas. At that time, that sort of became conference ground, ground zero. Because, lots of lamas were in Nepal and lots were in South India. Some were up in Darjeeling side. They were scattered all over India. So every year, Dalai Lama, Sakya Trizin, and the heads of the different schools would kind of decide where should we all get together this year. And that way all Tibetans who could get away and travel. And I think Bodh Gaya was very, very popular with Tibetans in those days because easy to get to. The train went right to Gaya. Inexpensive, so people could just bring a tent and set it up in a field, which lots of Tibetans did. And sometimes whole cities would spring up. I mean, the town of Bodh Gaya probably has 1,000 or 2,000 people. When Dalai Lama gave Kalachakra there in Christmas 73, was it, and January 74, over that period, 350,000 people showed up, setting up tents and so on. And then for 10 or 12 days, every day, Dalai Lama gives 3-4 hours teaching and initiations. And then he has the heads of the other schools generally give some teachings or empowerments and so on. So in that way, I had the opportunities to meet Dalai Lama privately and publicly many, many times, and to attend literally hundreds of hours of his teachings and initiation. So I think I'm very fortunate that in my teen years, I happened to come across a book that had his name. And when I saw the name, it gave me an electric shock. And I thought, goodness, I have to meet that guy.
Thank you very much for your wonderful answer. And the second question is about the qualities of His Holiness. You already mentioned one very important quality, that he has this immediate direct connection with anyone he meets, this kind of intimacy. But what are the other qualities of His Holiness that inspire you all over your life and that you would like to mention?
Well, I mean, there's an expression in Tibetan poetry that what one can say about someone's good quality is about as much water from the ocean that you can pull out on the tip of a blade of grass. So when the first Dalai Lama wrote a poem on the life of the Buddha, he uses that kind of expression. What I've said here is just but a drop from the ocean drawn out with the tip of a grass compared to all the great qualities. I suppose one of the things I think that impresses everyone very much is the fact that every time you meet him, or every time one meets the Dalai Lama, whatever he says, even if it's something he's said a dozen times in a similar way, he always has a way of putting it that brings a sense of newness or freshness to it. So, after studying Dharma for 20 years, one has heard most Dharma teachings to some extent. But the amazing thing with Dalai Lama is every time he teaches it, it's almost like he's reading it for the first time himself, excitedly, reading it excitingly, with the profound insights he's discovering in it. And so it's almost like he's able to look at everything with new, fresh eyes every time he looks at it. And in Tibetan Buddhism, I think they call that Namtok Mepa. In other words, relaxing the partial view, relaxing a kind of a prejudiced way or a preconceived notion. Milarepa says in one of his poems, "Be like the elephant walking through the forest, no fear and no expectations." So expectations limit the way we see things. For instance, if we eat a very delicious chocolate cake, but we were comparing it before we eat it, we're comparing it to one chocolate cake we ate when we were in Bavaria. Then we don't actually taste the cake we're eating. We're kind of getting lost we're mixing it. So, Lama Tsongkhapa says in his Lamrim Chemo, is that whenever you receive a Dharma teaching, you should avoid the way of the three pots, upside down so nothing gets in, which means your preconceived ideas are so strong that you're not actually listening to what's being said. You're just bouncing it off of things that you think you know. And that's always a problem. So I think, so that's one of the three. And I think the other two are like pouring it into a pot that has yesterday's leftover food in it. So the fresh food gets destroyed by the old food that gets mixed into it, and it just all basically becomes a stomach disaster formula. And thirdly, the pot with a hole in it, where you're there, but you just don't hear anything that's being said. It goes in and out the other, goes in one ear and out the other, in the top and out the bottom. So I think one of the most remarkable qualities of the Dalai Lama is that he actually embodies those wisdoms of avoiding the three pots. Whenever you meet him, it's not like he's got all these preconceived notions and is seeing you through yesterday's eyes. It's almost like he's seeing you for the first time, but at the same time, not like the pot with the hole in the bottom, because maybe he hasn't seen you for 20 or 30 years and he'll still completely remember you and recognize you and just remind you of when he last saw you. And with no preconceived notions, it's not like he cares if you're a Buddhist or a non-Buddhist or an engineer or a taxi driver or a student or a professor. Each human being, I think in eyes of the Dalai Lama, is equally a pilgrim on the road to enlightenment, regardless of how good or evil they are at the present moment. So, and for that reason, I think everyone who meets him, certainly in a private capacity, becomes quite overwhelmed with the intimacy, because usually only with our own mom and dad is that kind of intimacy there, or our own immediate family members. And even then, often we find it difficult to get over little irritations we have with him over the years, or little differences of opinions on this, that, and the other. Whereas Dalai Lama can look at anyone and be completely open and fresh. And in terms of memory, I remember the friend of mine in my Dharamsala days in the 1970s, and when Dalai Lama came to the States in like maybe end of 80s or early 90s. So it was 20 years since he had seen this guy. And when he saw the guy, he was like, young and clean shaven and had short hair. And he meets him in California and he's like, I don't know, 20 kilos heavier, has a big beard and has long hair. And when Dalai Lama's walking out of the airport building and the fellow is one of, 200 or 300 people standing in line, Dalai Lama looked at him, then looks back and walks up and says, "Oh, you grew beard." So that kind of ability, you could say a photographic memory with facial recognition software is very unique. And I think he doesn't remember any of the bad things, or they don't affect the way he remembers. His ability is to remember why he likes you, not various reasons why he may have differences of opinions with you of this or that or the other. I think when I was living in Dharamsala, quite a few of the lamas liked me to visit because I speak quite openly with lamas. I remember Dalai Lama's abbot of Dalai Lama's monastery, the great Namkal Khensa Rinpoche. He'd been Gyuto abbot for many years, Gyume abbot for many years, and then abbot of Dalai Lama's monastery for 14 years. And then he was very, very old. And one time when he saw me walking down the street, he waved me in, and that's the first time I met him. And after it, he said, no other persons who visits ever talks to me in ordinary ways. They all sit like this and stick out their tongues and don't say anything. But when you come, you'll talk about anything. So you're going to have to come once a week. So I can find out what's going on in this world. And I think Dalai Lama is a bit like that. He really likes to meet people on their own ground. And he has no problem with people taking issue. For instance, after Dalai Lama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, and I visited him in Dharamsala a couple of months later, and he said, "Oh, what do you think about this?" And I was just coming back from China and Tibet. I just made a visit to Tibet in January, and I was coming back. I visited him before going and after coming back. And I said, "Well, with your Nobel Peace Prize money, you really should think about how to overthrow China. It's very overthrowable." And this peace, Pacific policy towards Chinese, I don't think it works with communists. Better be a little bit tough guy. And Dalai Lama didn't mind the fact that I don't like the idea of nonviolence as political strategy. I mean, it's a good first option, but it rarely works for fast, effective change, in my opinion. And so I said that very clearly to Dalai Lama on a number of occasions in interviews and other places when I was doing newspaper or magazine articles. And anything going on in Tibetan world that I didn't agree with, I would be quite happy to bring it up in conversation. And Dalai Lama never took offense at it. Always, he would just kind of look at it in kind of open way and usually laugh a little bit and say something about why he doesn't go that way. So I think this kind of open-mindedness, but at the same time, complete memory retention, but able to look at the beauty in all things. So they have an expression in Tibetan Buddhism: we should learn to see every sentient being with the love and compassion that a mother who has only one child holds for that child. And I would say Dalai Lama really does embody that in a very simple, down to earth, non-ostentatious, non-condescending way. I sometimes mention the difference between compassion in Buddhism and compassion in, say, Christianity, the tradition in which I grew up as a child. I think in compassion, it's almost like we're free from suffering and we're saved, and we're looking sort of down at those people who are in a more difficult position than us and trying to pull them up. It's kind of a looking down with sort of distant eyes, in my way of reading it. Whereas in the Buddhist world, it's like we're this little child looking up at the mother. And so that person, a mother in my previous life. So it's a kind of a looking up at others in states requiring compassion, rather than looking down from a place of ease and security, trying to pull people up to that. And so Dalai Lama really embodies that sentiment, I think. He always has the ability to give the sense that he's looking up to you, but at the same time is completely 100% confident in his own being, his own soul, if you will. So for me, that's very great. And his commitment to Dharma practice, I suppose. You know, even though he achieved enlightenment in 1967, he continues to meditate 6 or 7 hours a day, every day, as a way of kind of being a good role model to others. So if I were to dip a tip of grass into the ocean of good qualities of Dalai Lama, those are the few drops I can easily pull out.
I would like to ask you about the other side of His Holiness. He is, you mentioned that, well, he is, of course, a great philosopher, teacher, and a wonderful person, but at the same time, he is a practitioner of the secret Tantrayana practices, Vajrayana practices. So, and they say that he is the manifestation of Avalokiteshvara. So could you please explain a little bit, what does it mean when we say that he is a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, and what is his, and say a few words about his Vajrayana practice?
Well, in terms of being manifestations of bodhisattvas or whatever, I think this tradition comes from the idea that of the Gyaltsen Yegye, the 8 great bodhisattvas, or Gyaltse, the 8 great sons of the Buddha or children of the Buddha. And each of those 8 bodhisattvas, so Shenra, Avalokiteshvara, Manjusri, Vajrapani, Maitreya, I won't list all 8 because my translator will forget what I said while I was saying them. But those are the 4 most important ones. And they all represent one of the 8 principal qualities of enlightenment. So we could say that everyone is kind of a manifestation of one of those 8, and that we are all on our way to enlightenment. And each of us, we could say, has a little bit of a different edge. Those who are emanations of Manjusri are a little bit more like the intellectual and the wisdom trainings, and those who are more kind of emotional, like the compassion side, and social oriented, benefiting society, you could say, like the compassion side. And then Maitreya is one of them. So those of us who are more like joy, celebrating, dancing, joy with others, more like a Maitreya emanation, and so on. So I think when we say a Lama is an emanation, this kind of comes a little bit with beings who are very spectacular in their manifestations in the world. So it's a kind of a code language for how these certain beings are very spectacular in terms of how they transform the world. So in my book, The 14 Dalai Lamas, A Sacred Legacy of Reincarnation, which is one of my main books of my 30 or 35 books, I would say the one that's gotten translated into the most foreign languages, at least. I rely upon a collection in which it speaks about 56 previous incarnations of the Dalai Lama. And it goes through, like, there's the 14 as the Dalai Lama. And before that, there's the 10 as sort of Dharma kings. And also 10 as great spiritual masters. Like, for instance, Kungan Nyingpo, the founder of the Sakya school, or one of the main founders. And Sakya Pandita, one of the early Sakya Lamas, who was very instrumental. Not Pandita, Chogyal Pakpa, the guru of the great Mongolian Buddhist king, the good Buddhist Chinggis Khan, the very good Buddhist Chinggis Khan. Kublai Khan's guru, Chogyal Pakpa, rather, previous incarnation as lamas. And then 36 in India, which are previous lives of Lama Drum. So that list of 56, I sort of draw from that a little bit in my book on the 14 Dalai Lamas. And in that, those are all said to be, all those 56, emanations of Shinrikyi, which continued their Dharma work. And so came back in a continuum. So we could say this is a little bit connected to the idea of when we achieve enlightenment, Ku Sung Tok Yunden Chinle, our mind becomes Dharmakaya, the oceanic, infinite, formless experience. If we were to put that in Christian language, would say becomes one with the Godhead, or some of the Buddhist words, it's like a drop of water arrives at the ocean. Until it gets at the ocean, it's like an independent drop, then becomes like an ocean. And then in that ocean, because of the great bodhicitta, because of the presence of strong bodhisattva mind, wants to manifest in the world in ways that benefit others. So it manifests as Sambhogakaya, as sort of a blissful, joyful forms to guide beings or assist beings on higher levels. In other words, Aryas, to help the Aryas, those who are on the 10 bodhisattva saintly levels. You could say, not only bodhisattva, actually, also the Shravaka, Prajika, Bhumis. So any of the 10 saintly levels of the Hinayana Mahayana platforms. And then Nirmanakaya, manifesting from the deepest hell and the ghost realms and the animal realms and the human realms and the Asura realms and the worldly devil realms to benefit beings. That's Kusung Tok. And Yundan, manifesting with whatever qualities seem appropriate in those times and places. And Chinle, Kusung Tok, the fifth being Chinle, Buddha Karma, that sort of manifesting activities which will benefit and uplift the world. So when we do daily practice of, say, Yamantaka, Chakra Samvara, Guhya Samaja, we sort of enact these 5 in the basic sadhana on generation stage. First stage of Tantra, dissolving into clear light of death, becoming like Dharmakaya, coming out of clear light of death into the bardo as like Sambhogakaya form of enlightenment, taking rebirth as Nirmanakaya, meaning manifesting as a complete deity like Yamantaka, so on and so forth. Performing this called the Dakpa in Tibetan, recollecting the enlightenment qualities of the mandala, which is Yunden, like the excellences or the realizations of enlightenment. And finally, Tinle, Buddha Karma. We do the mantras and emanate energy through the 6 realms of samsara and also in the realms of nirvana to bring beings to samyak sambodhi, or to spread enlightenment, samyak sambodhi, fragrance or aroma throughout the 3 times in 10 directions. So we sort of practice that. And I think so when we say someone's emanation of Shenrezhi, we could take that in various ways, but Tibetans like to think of it as if we look at texts by, say, Asanga in India, the great Asanga, Papa Tome, the statements like on the first Arya Bodhisattva level, the being can send out many emanations. The next Arya, 10 times that number. Next time, 10 times that number. In other words, the ability to have multiple reincarnations simultaneously is there. When the second Dalai Lama passed away, they asked the state oracle where to find his reincarnation. And the oracle replied, he's taken 100 reincarnations in central Tibet. So the challenge will be to identify which one will do the best job. So Tibetans like to think of each Dalai Lama as having been an immediate one of the predecessor. I don't know if it always means necessarily that, or if it just means that this being, whoever is chosen, shows signs of being capable of doing the best job. In other words, they show signs of Kusung Tok Yunden Tinle, of the body, speech, mind, excellences, and Buddha activities. And in the case of the third Dalai Lama, the reincarnation of the second, they chose what they call the body emanation rather than the teaching or the other, because they wanted him to continue the very exact, very precise network of Buddha activity of the second. And so the third, therefore, goes on to take what the first and second Dalai Lama had done and to expand that. As it's often, as the Dalai Lama, present Dalai Lama once put when I was interviewing him, the first Dalai Lama, those early Dalai Lamas had master plan. The first Dalai Lama spread his Dharma through Western and Central Tibet. And then the second Dalai Lama came along and reinforced spreading it through Central Tibet and Southern Tibet. And then the third Dalai Lama came along and he expanded it through all Eastern Tibet and up into the Mongol regions and through North Tibet. And then the fourth Dalai Lama came along and he was, his reincarnation was found up amongst the Mongols in near Hohat, near Inner Mongolia, under Chinese occupation these days, but at that time an independent nation. And he sort of solidified all of these various activities quite well. And then because of their work, when the fifth Dalai Lama came along and he was chosen to continue the Tinle, so he was a natural choice to become spiritual and temporal leader of Central Asia. So in 1642, after, I don't know, almost 50 years of civil wars amongst various Tibetan petty kings and Mongolian petty kings and whatnot, the powers that be thought, we need a Lama peacemaker to guide this nation. And they looked at a half a dozen options for who to choose. And they chose the fifth Dalai Lama. Many different reasons. One, which is sometimes mentioned, is that his mother was related to the Karma Kagyu king of Shigatse, who was a very super warmonger. I mean, he and his father and his father's father had been at war most of their ruling lives. Sometimes with Gelugpas, but mostly with Drikung Kagyu and with Drukpa Kagyus. In fact, they had been so troublemaking that the Drikung Drukpa split into two, and one of them ran to Bhutan and took over Bhutan and changed the name of Bhutan from Mun to Drukyul, Drukpa Kargyu country, dragon country, after the name of his school. And, the Drukpas had sort of been, the Drikungpas had sort of been hammered into the ground by the Karma Kargyupas and so on. And so at that time, because the fifth Dalai Lama's mother was related to the Karma Kargyu, the super warsome group of Tibetans. If 90% of Tibetan wars can be traced to Karma Kargyu kings. So they're very, very enthusiastic leaders, you could say alpha dog types. And his father was mainly Nyingma, which was very important. And then in Gelugpa, the line, then he was a Gelugpa Tulku, and meaning Gelugpa is a fusion of Kargyu, Drikung Kargyu, Sakya, Kadampa, Shiche, about 20 different schools of the so-called Sarma schools. So they chose the fifth Dalai Lama because he kind of had a finger in every pie genetically and spiritually, you could say. And therefore, as this continued with Dalai Lamas, as he did a good job, and then there's some problems in sixth Dalai Lama's time due to civil wars in Mongolia and elsewhere. But then the seventh Dalai Lama came along and did a wonderful job. And Tibet continued under the guidance of Dalai Lamas until the Chinese invasion of 1951, when, of course, things changed radically due to the heavy-handedness and murderous predisposition of Chairman Mao and his band of cutthroats, thugs and cutthroats. So in terms of Sutra and Tantra, all Tibetan schools, including Bonpo, have Sutra, Buddha's open teaching, or we say Hinayana, 3 higher trainings with 8 Noble Fold Path and 12 links of dependent origination. Those doctrines of Hinayana are the basis of all Tibetan schools of Buddhism, including Bon, the so-called pre-Buddhist, but pre-Buddhist there just meaning pre-Songtsen Gompo Buddhist, using the older pre-Songtsen Gompo languages and dictionaries and grammar. And then Mahayana, which really means a united lineage of Asanga and Nagarjuna and Asanga, with what they often are known as Gentruk Choknyi, the 2 supreme ones, Asanga and Nagarjuna and Asanga, and the 6 ornaments, meaning the 2 great disciples of those 2 masters, Aryadeva and Vasubandhu, the 2 great Abhidharma masters, Gunaprabha, Sakyaprabha, and the 2 great dialecticians, you could say, or epistemologists, how to talk about enlightenment sensibly without falling into blind, silly, devotional dogma. Dignaga and Dharmakirti. So all Tibetan schools follow that from the Sutra side. And from Tantra's side, all Tibetan schools, including Bonpo, follow what's known as the 4 classes of Tantra. And so, they specialize, different schools specialize a little bit in different Tantras, but they all follow those 4 very strongly. Dalai Lama's, of course, the ordination, the first Dalai Lama achieved enlightenment under Tsongkhapa, and Tsongkhapa's great disciple, so his ordination is usually Gelugpa. And Gelugpa is largely new tantras, or the Sarma tantras of the 11th century. In other words, Drikung Kargyu, Shalu, Sakya, Kadampa, Shiche, Ralug, Bari, all those different new schools that formed in the 10 and 1100s and 1200s. And those are generally of 2 kinds, a Baigyu, the hidden meaning tantras like Chakrasamvara. And there in Russia, of course, you have that Andrei Terentiev, who was a secret Chakrasamvara yogi, achieved deeply realized in all of the practices and secret yogas. So anything you need to know about secret Tantra and Dalai Lamas, you can just ask Andre. He can tell you directly in Russian, whereas I'll have to say half the words in Tibetan and say something like an approximate meaning in English, and then you'll have to put the approximate English meaning to an approximate Russian word. Anyway, all Dalai Lamas have done Songde Jigtsum, great Guhya Samaja Tantra from Marpa Lotsawa, and from Nagarjuna, there's Shablug, Pakpelug, rather, sorry. And Chakra Samvara, both Luipa, Gantapada, and Krishnacharan Mahasiddha Yoga lineages are all three very popular with Dalai Lamas. And Dalai Lama gives those initiations quite frequently. I had the good karma once in Dharamsala with just like maybe 8 or 10 of us in Dalai Lama's temple at the request of Bob Thurman. It was the first Westerner to be ordained a monk by Dalai Lama. And even though he was no longer a monk, Dalai Lama didn't hold it against him, and at his request gave about, I guess, 8 or 10 of us privately 2 days of the Gantapada transmission. And he gave Luipa transmission many times in different places. He's given Guhya Samaja and Yamantaka. It's hard to say what is his favorite practice, of course. And on top of the Dalai Lamas, as from time of second Dalai Lama, have combined a lot of Nyingma practice in with their Sarma practice. So Dalai Lamas traditionally bring in quite a bit of Nyingma. And in fact, the 5th Dalai Lama and the 13th Dalai Lamas are both sort of marked as heads of particular Nyingma lineages. For instance, in Nyingma with the Jangtir, the 5th Dalai Lama goes on the top of the list as the main lineage holder of his generation. And his disciple and also guru, they exchange various lineage. Chogyar Lingpa goes there either before or after him in some lineages, because some lineages he received from Chogyar Lingpa and some he gave to Chogyar Lingpa. And later, I think that became the foundation of Mindraling Monastery, if I recollect correctly. Yeah, and so Dalai Lamas continue teaching all 4 classes of Tantra, Kriya Tantras like Tara and Shenrezi, which you could say are kind of introductory, everyday, casual, easy to practice ones. And the Charya, which get a little bit more complicated, Yoga, and then highest Yoga. I like the way in Tantra, Tantra likes to use the word of sex and romance. And being of Irish blood from my father's side, I also like sex and romance imagery. So Kriya Tantra, and I was talking about the level of intimacy or non-duality experienced when it talks about these 4 levels of Tantra. So Kriya Tantra is like when you're a young man or a young woman walking through the market, and you see someone of the opposite sex, and bang, your eyes touch, and whoosh, the world explodes in lights and fireworks, and you think, wow, what happened? There's a sense that the world is good, the world is great, the world is wonderful. There's joy and bliss and pleasure in this world, and it's indeed a good place. Just that touch of the caress of romance or love on your eye unexpectedly as you're walking through a busy marketplace. Going through a busy marketplace, you're hustling and bustling and being bumped here and there, and there's lots of dust and dirt and people yelling, lots of distractions. So at that time, the world doesn't seem so great. But then the caress of those beautiful eyes, and whoo, you're in a paradise momentarily. That's like Kriya Tantra. And maybe a few days later, you meet again, and this time, you say, hey, I saw you before, and then you talk a little bit and laugh and perhaps even touch hands discreetly. And so that's it. Life has become even more warm, joyful, and pleasant. And then so this is like Charya Tantra. And then Yoga Tantra is like, you meet a third time, and this time you kiss. And again, when you kiss, the goodness of the world, your sense of the goodness of the world, of the joy of being human, and the radiance, the awakenedness of being human, and the basic harmony or goodness of being human. These three qualities become much more strong. Then highest Yoga Tantra, it's like full-fledged sex leading to orgasm. At the moment of orgasm, you explode into the world in which all duality disappears. There's just the three qualities of bliss, utter wide-awake radiance, and a sense of the complete unity of lover and beloved. So often tantras are explained, the difference between the four classes of tantras, in this kind of mystical language. You know, if people who are fans of Sufi poetry will notice the similarity to Tantra and sort of Sufi romanticism. Wine and love are sort of metaphors for the highest spiritual accomplishment. Drunkenness and sexual completion, sexual orgasm, used as metaphors for a highest mystical experience. And that's also drunkenness is used in Tantra in that same way. You could say Kriya Tantra is like a little sip of wine, and Charya Tantra is maybe a sip of wine followed up with a beer. Yoga Tantra is like maybe a couple of bottles of ordinary vodka. And highest Yoga Tantra is like 10 bottles of Beluga. Anyway, yeah. So, sometimes people say, well, Tantra uses a lot of sexual imagery. How do monks, celibate monks and so forth, manage to do it? Actually, it doesn't matter if we're celibate or not celibate. We have the sperm from our father and the ovum from our mother, and these are the basis of our physical body. So at any one time, we're a 50-50 equation, man, woman. And at the last moment before we enter into the womb, at the time just before rebirth, we make a decision which one we're going to be, male or female. But the full force of genetically from the mother and father there of this lifetime, physically we're 50-50, male, female. And coming from previous lives, you could say also 50-50, sometimes male, sometimes female. And wherever we are in this world, sex is all around us, isn't it? Like right now it's springtime. If I look out the window, I see bugs making love and birds mating and trying to make some babies. And, so the mammals started a little bit earlier, the mooses and the deers and the raccoons, because they want their babies born quite early in spring, so they'll have all summer and autumn to get big and strong. So when winter comes, they'll have strong enough legs to survive the snow. So we're surrounded by a world in which at any given time, there's probably 10 trillion beings making love at any moment. We might be celibate. We might think we're celibate. But that whole energy is pervading every aspect of our being. That's why I often say Freud was really a bodhisattva, Sigmund Freud, because he really introduced the West to this, challenged the West to understand that every one of us is completely a sexual being, whether we like it or not, or whether we're comfortable with it or not. And without understanding our sexuality, there is no mental sanity. And I think that's why Tibetan monks are very, very likable, you could say. Even though they're celibate, they're very approachable because they understand that, they may be walking a celibate path, but nonetheless, they're walking in a forest in which there's 10 trillion beings making love at any one moment within a couple of kilometers of where they are. And there's nothing to be shy about it. So for that reason, in Tantra, sometimes we see Buddha represented as, say, Vajradhara Yabgyum, Vajradhara in consort, or Vajrasattva in union with a sexual consort, or most highest Yoga Tantra deities in their main form will be male-female in union, to represent how we only achieve enlightenment when we fulfill the genetic inheritance of our male-female ancestors, when we draw from that and transform it. And we take everything we learned from our previous lives as men, previous lives as women, say the way men are aggressive and actively, powerfully conquering and killing, and the way women, on the other hand, are fostering, wise, open, accepting, and how we learn both of those in perfect balance, we achieve enlightenment. And of course, Freud started that movement, and Jung, his great disciples, was also a sort of closet Buddhist, or an out of the closet, 1 foot out of the closet Buddhist, and wrote prefaces to big forwards to books like Tibetan Book of the Dead in 1927. I think also Tibetan Book of Tibetan Yoga and Secret Doctrines. He wrote, anyway, 2 of the Evans Wentz books edited by Evans Wentz in the Oxford series. So he brings a lot of sort of Buddhist tantric thinking into Western psychology. Unfortunately, in the West, based on Christianity, we got this weird idea of the Garden of Eden, and everything's hunky-dory until Eve eats an apple and a snake shows up, and then the fig leaves. And until now, we're still a little shy about eating apples, and figs usually come in dried form with none of the leaves in there, just in case we're tempted to put them over our genitals. And throughout the history of Christianity, sort of the way in which women are sort of disparaged, you could say. They're kind of blamed for us. Adam was quite happy in the Garden of Eden until Eve said, "Here, take this bite of apple. It'll give you a nice big erection, then we can have sex." And so it all comes from Eve giving the apple some sort of aphrodisiac to poor old Adam. And on account of that, women have sort of been persecuted, you could say, throughout the last 2,000 years of Western history. And before that, to some extent, and not only in Christianity, but all the 3 Semitic religions, the Jews, the Christians, and later the Muslims, the Islam, they're all coming from this kind of Garden of Eden mythology of how woman is the temptress, and when men fall because of the tempting quality of the apple, and the need to wear fig leaves. So I think Tantra goes a long way against that. And of course, Tantra is far older than the Buddha. I don't at all agree with this sort of Western Oxford, Cambridge idea. Buddha taught original Buddhism, and later other people added Mahayana, and then Tantra comes later. These are historical unfoldments, phases of an unfolding flower. And in Buddhism, we think all were taught by Buddha. We don't follow that at all. And somehow Oxford and Cambridge professors were able to sell this myth of original Buddhism. And then later, the fishy stories from Nagarjuna and Asanga and so on, and sort of make it like these are later developments. And Tantra, again, a later development. We can say these are later social unfoldings. In the early days of Buddha, Emperor Ashoka made all of India Buddhism and declared what he would accept as his national Buddhism. And we can call that early Buddhism. We can call King Ashoka's branded, stamped, sealed, and delivered brand of Buddhism. But we can't call it Buddhism. We shouldn't say anything else as later. Just not endorsed by Emperor King Ashoka. Or we could say the dictator, murderous dictator Ashoka. And so naturally Tantra, these 3 come through India as syncretic wholes, and they come into Tibet as syncretic or a holistic, unified, three roots of one tree, you could say. Tibetans agree it like that. And Dalai Lamas have maintained that Triyana Buddhism very strongly throughout their history. So if we look at the first Dalai Lama, his commentaries, the various written works are, some are on sutra, some are on tantra. So because he founded Tashi Lumpo Monastery, then naturally he made textbooks for the young monks of Tashi Lumpo, and later Tashi Lumpo had 5,000 monks, and they still study his Abhidharma text is very famous, and his Prajnaparamita Abhisamyamkara commentary, his commentary to Nagarjuna, his commentary to Chandrakirti. So these are sutra studies for Tashi Lumpo. But I had the good fortune to read his commentary to Generation Completion Stage Kala Chakra. And to read that with the great Lati Rinpoche, one of the greatest living Kala Chakra masters. And he just sort of sat like this and went, wada, 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 wada. Like he was saying the alphabet. It was no difficulty for him to penetrate the meaning of every single syllable. So the first Dalai Lama did that, and second Dalai Lama similarly, many texts on, he's famous for his books on Trengye Leksheng Yingpo, his commentary to differentiating the difference between a Sangha's mind-only school and the movements from Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka, which don't go along with a Sangha's way of reading it. But at the same time, he wrote commentaries to 6 yogas of Naropa, 6 yogas of Niguma, to Kala Chakra practice, Vajra practice, and many, many others.
You mentioned that, speaking of emanations, you mentioned that there might be like hundreds of emanations, and it was just a matter of choosing the right one to do the job, right? Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the mission of the current 14th Dalai Lama? What is his job?
Well, if you read my book on the 14 Dalai Lamas, a sacred legacy of reincarnation, in the account of the 13th Dalai Lama, in 1932, the 13th had given a public proclamation saying that the evil communist barbarians have already destroyed much of the Mongol republics, meaning Burayat and Tuva, large parts of Siberia, Kalmykia, and had started to take over independent Mongolia, which that came in 1924, and to destroy much of Buddhism down there. And then he said, I am almost 58, so I have to look to the future a little bit, and we all have to look to the future. So now we can see that this evil face of, he called it the barbaric redism, will sweep further east and will take over China. And then from outside and inside, we'll suffer a lot of great strengths. Great threats and great destructions. I'm almost 58, and this is a concern. So what we should do is build a very strong military on our eastern borders and keep out, resist this military threat. And I think his idea was to be quite easy to resist it, given the high ground of Tibet. Then he said, if we don't do that, then I'm almost 58. And then if we get taken over, all of our institutions will be destroyed. Our lamas will be either killed or scattered like ants around the planet. And our people will be turned into refugees and beggars. And so many people take that as a prophecy that if Tibetans didn't follow his wish to build a strong military, then Tibet would be in a disastrous situation. So it's said that the next year it became obvious that the powers that be in Tibet, how do you build a strong military? It takes strong decision, doesn't it? You have to start spending 25 or 30% of your GDP on the military. If you don't, how do you resist invasion by China or by other nations? You have to buy machine guns and rocket launchers, and or you have to set up factories and manufacture them, but it's easier to buy them. And so, it would take a big bite out of Tibet's national economy. And some people thought, well, Buddhism is nonviolent, maybe we shouldn't do that. And then aristocrats thought, well, we're the ones who will be the main source of that tax base. So we don't like giving a third of our income to create a military. And then some lamas thought, if they make a strong military, maybe the military will turn against Dharma and create a military dictatorship, sort of like Japan or something like that, right? Sort of a military dictatorship, or like has happened in Burma in the 50s, but that's much later. But so that was a concern of some of the lamas. Anyway, it became obvious that this was not going to happen. There was resistance from the aristocratic base and from the monastic elders. And so it's said that Dalai Lama was prophesied to live until age 78 if Tibetans would do what he had said needed to be done to save Tibet. And when it became obvious they were not going to do that, he had to make a choice. Just stay there. And then when China invaded Tibet, he would be in his late 70s or early 80s. And so basically would be dead within a short time of the invasion. Or at the very least, even if he did meditations to extend his lifespan, would be a very old, not very mobile guy, sort of walking around with a cane. And therefore, he should depart and come back so that when the Chinese invasion came and Tibet was defenseless, he would be a young, the first Dalai Lama's name at birth was Running Deer or Swift Deer. He would be a young running deer, able to lead the Tibetans to some sort of success. And so for that reason, the following year, he manifested the theater of illness and passed away to come back as a young boy who would be in his late teens and early 20s by the time China got around to taking over Tibet. And so he died then, and 1933, and the reincarnation was recognized, I think, in 1937, and was taken first to Litong Monastery and then put in Kumbum Monastery. In 1939, was brought by Reting Rinpoche to Lhasa and enthroned as Dalai Lama and put into a very strict training regime, knowing that there was no time. What is that Talking Head song? This ain't no party. This ain't no fooling. This ain't no fooling around. He had to finish his training very quickly under the great masters of Tibet, because he would be facing imminent disaster. And of course, this came to pass in 1949 when the Dalai Lama was only 10 years old. China announced internationally its plan to invade Tibet. They called it liberate, but that really just meant liberate from being not part of communist China. And in 1951, they moved their army up to the Tibetan border, and 1950 up to the Tibetan border, and tried to push for a treaty. And then the next year moved it a little bit further into Tibet and forced the treaty with Tibet. So Tibet, 49, the downside was China had been an ally of America and Europe against Hitler in World War II and against Japan in World War II. So, and England had left India in 1947 and left the country in charge of Nehru, a sort of brainless lawyer with no knowledge of international politics, and kind of brilliant, you could say, leader for getting independence from England, perhaps, but a total nincompoop when it came to international policy and even domestic policy. I mean, he took a reasonably affluent India and threw it into abject poverty within 10 years, made it one of the poorest countries on earth, with the 200 families that supported him becoming billionaires and the rest of the country thrown into abject poverty. But India under Nehru, 49, Tibetan government sent a delegate to talk to him and sent him to England. And England said, no, we can't help if China is going to invade, because we left India and we're just recuperating from World War II. And China was our ally against Japan. And then sent them to America and said, Tibet, what's a tablet? Is that like a biscuit or something? And so America said, whatever England does, we'll support. So they went back to England, and England said, well, go back and talk it out with Nehru, whatever he says. So we'll have to think it through. And they went to Nehru, and Nehru was basically a Sinophile. His idea was that if I give Tibet to China, this will become an olive branch in creating a great alliance between India and China to take over the West, Europe, and Americas as the superpower of the world. So he basically gave Tibet to China in that hope that this would be good for a long-term policy for India with friendship with China. Of course, it opened up a 3,000-mile border with China that had never existed. So since that time, China and India have been killing each other back and forth across that border continually. Dozens of people die every year from that stupid decision of Nehru. Now, I said this once in the India International Center in less dramatic language, of course, but said basically the whole Tibet problem was created by Nehru, and made the Indian government a little irritated at me. What can I tell you? But anyway, so Dalai Lama was born into that period and had to, instead of having a Tibet that was well defended, and at that time when communism came in China, it would have been quite easy for Tibet to defend itself. It was an impregnable mountain forest. It had always been difficult. It had always been easy to invade Tibet, but almost impossible to keep it, because once you're inside, you've only got a month or two before the mountain passes snow over. Then you can't get in and you can't send in supplies. And flying in over those huge mountains, 6,000-7,000 meters, not an easy job. So then Dalai Lama tried to work out with China, and then came into exile when things fell apart, and in exile did a wonderful job helping to set up all the institutions in India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Ladakh, not only settling refugees, but setting up all the monastic training programs, medical center training programs. schools for young people, designing, a kind of integrated education system for Tibetan schools, combining sort of modern Western style education, which is something the 13th had tried to do, but had met too much resistance. So it fulfilled the 13th's desire to take things that way, but combining traditional Tibetan education with international education, you could say. So of the Dalai Lama accomplishments, when he came into India, 1959, he was only 22 years old or something, 37, 47. Yeah, 22 years old when he came into exile, right? And so he was young and full of beans and could do all of that. And he sort of became the symbolic head of Tibet wherever he went. Any other Lama went there, they represented Tibetan Buddhism, or a Tibetan went there, they represented kind of Tibet to a certain extent. But wherever the Dalai Lama was, it became like that was Tibet. And he used that not for personal gain, but to completely dedicate all of his time and energy to preserving the Tibetan tradition. Meanwhile, back in Tibet, Tibet's 6,500 monasteries and temples and libraries, all but 12 or 13 were destroyed to the foundations. And even the 13 that were not destroyed were closed, with all of the leaders, whether they're monks, nuns, or spiritual leaders, or just social leaders, either killed or put in prison or forced into collaboration, a kind of forced slavery, you could say. So back in Tibet, everything was beaten down basically to the Stone Age. If you saw photos of Tibet in the late 70s, then it would just look like like Dresden look in Germany after the bombings of that ended the war in Germany. Just everything smashed down to the foundations. But meanwhile, in India, the Dalai Lama managed to get everything up and running and traveled a lot internationally to bring awareness of Tibet and sympathy for Tibet, got international aid organizations to support, opened orphanages for all the kids coming out whose parents were killed on the way, or when they got out, there was no place for them to live. So put them in sort of boarding schools, pusakang, they call them in Tibetan, children villages, and created a number of them for kids who were complete orphans. And then when they got them up and running, then for the semi-orphans, and then for people who it was better for their kids to be in school for much of the year so they could have a more focused concentration for studying. And creating, the drama school, TIPA, Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts, to preserve Tibetan's artistic traditions, Thangka schools, statue schools, bronze and metalwork art schools. So everything from arts to music to performing arts to monasteries to literature and so on, working out with American government that they could use the PL 480, some billions of dollars that had been invested in India, loaned to India, could use them to publish Tibetan books in India to save literature and so on. And so Dalai Lama oversaw all of that. So what he did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is truly, truly, truly remarkable that one human being could accomplish so much. And of course, we can look at things he didn't accomplish and grumble about them a little bit, and some people do. But a problem is if you do 1,000 things, a couple of them will not go right. And then where does the blame for them not going well fall on? So, there are people who grumble a little bit about this or that with Dalai Lama. They wish this wouldn't have happened or more of that would have happened and so on. But if we look at what he accomplished, we can say it's 10,000 amazingly successful tasks over the period of that now 60 years they've been. By 20 years ago, Tibetan refugees in India were now more successful, more wealthy, more affluent, better educated than most Indians in India, and the same in Nepal. And so it's just a kind of symptom of the success of his policies in education and in resettlement and in organization. Even things like, family planning and birth control and things like this, it was all contributed to that kind of success of the Tibetans as a people. So you can say, Dalai Lama has 99% of the credit for that success, because without him, there's nobody who represents Tibet to all Tibetans. Some people say, what about the Karmapa? Well, even within Kargyupa, there's 12 Kargyu schools, and 4 of them are always arguing with each other, often at war, military war with one another for the last 500, 600, 700 years. So it's, except for Dalai Lama, there's not really one figure who can unify everyone. Now, Dalai Lama has pushed for a kind of democracy in the future where they won't need to rely upon a Dalai Lama. I don't know. I don't think there's that much chance that democracy will produce someone of that kind of quality. So I think this Dalai Lama has to live another 20 years and then has to come back quickly and get smart very quickly, just like this one did, knowing it's a disaster time, and come back soon and become fully trained by the age of 16.
Thank you very much for your answer. And my last question, actually, we are Buddhists, and as Buddhists, as His Holiness actually says all the time, that we need to study and we need to learn. So what shall we learn from His Holiness the Dalai Lama?
All schools of Tibetan Buddhism put become enlightened. So when I met Dalai Lama, he said, remember, we don't need more Buddhists, we need more Buddhas. We don't need more people calling themselves Buddhists. We need more people, because the name Buddha just means woke up or enlightened. We need more enlightened beings. So how do we become more enlightened? And all schools of Tibetan Buddhism mention a threefold method, Tupa, Sampa, Gompa, by learning or listening. So sometimes we say study, but actually the words used, Tupa, means listening, because hearing from a living master is important, because it puts the context in the present world. Otherwise, Dharma is supposed to last for 5,000 years. Buddha Shakyamuni's lineage is supposed to continue for 5,000 years. So it constantly needs to be reframed. Old frames become obsolete, and it needs a new framing and sort of UV protective glass. And that comes through oral transmission and the guidance of a direct master. So in Russia, I think you've got quite a few lamas coming and going all the time and teaching. I know Yellow Tulku out in the east and comes to Moscow sometimes. And I've heard of a great Geshe who lives in Moscow and teaches. And of course, for Russians, Dalai Lama has started this Tibetan Classics series where he's put Tublin Chimpa, one of his oral translators, as editor of a series of books that he thinks are important for Western Buddhism. I don't know how many, there's a dozen or so have been published so far in the West. And I think Andrei Terentiev in St. Petersburg is one of the editors, perhaps the main editor of that with the Nartung project, putting those in Russian. Those are very fun, very important works, you could say, that Dalai Lama thinks are very important for the classics, to understand Buddhist classical ideas. But, Atisha was the great Joje Palan Atisha, who formed the Kadampa school, and I know he came to Tibet in 1042, and all the new schools are inspired by him. And then Nyingma, of course, sort of took over Kadampa, absorbed Kadampa lineages under Shabkar Rinpoche, and so many generations ago. So we could say his lineages go to all schools. And when he was asked, should we study the classics or study Menga oral transmission? he said oral transmission is the most important for one's own enlightenment. In other words, to make yourself a better human being, for you to grow in compassion, wisdom, and so forth. But at the same time, reading the classics and getting a deeper perspective brings depth to those menga, to those oral transmissions. So I suppose, in the West now, Dalai Lama probably has, I don't know, 50 or 75 books from various lectures he's given and teachings he's given around the world, and people meeting with him, interviewing him and making them into books. And I'm sure many of those are in Russian as well as other languages. Actually, the first book by any Dalai Lama to come out in any language was my own, of any earlier Dalai Lama, was in 1979, 1980. I did a translation of Third Dalai Lama's Lamrim Sir Shunma, Essence of Refined Gold. And in 1979, the Dalai Lama received his first-time visa to visit the US. And when Russia heard he was going to the US, they immediately said, oh, you have to come to Russia first. It's like going to the moon. We can't have the Dalai Lama going to America first. So they brought him to Moscow and then over to Ulan-Ude and down to Mongolia. And my book on the third Dalai Lama, with a commentary by the present Dalai Lama, came out just before that. And so it ended up being translated into Mongolian and published. And he took 50 or 100 copies with him and gave them out in Moscow and Ulan-Ude. And so 20 years later, when I went to Mongolia, they already knew me because that book had been there from the time the Dalai Lama came in 1979. Amazingly, it was my father-in-law who managed to get the Dalai Lama his first US visa, because he had never gotten a US visa. He had made numerous trips to Asian countries and to Europe, but had never gotten an American visa. And I had the good fortune that I was editing one of his series of talks from his European tour, I think in 1977. And I asked his secretary, how come he never goes to America, always goes to Europe? They said, oh, he can't get a visa to America. So I said, oh no, my father-in-law is very well-connected man. I'll have him check with CIA and the State Department for what's going on. And he wrote back and said, oh, the reason he can't get an American visa is he never asked for an American visa. Because in 1956, the CIA had started a sort of secret program in case China, with Tibetan refugees and underground guerrillas, to sort of resist communism, Chinese communism. And so the Tibetans in charge of that, whenever the issue of the Dalai Lama getting an American visa came up, they would always send the same Tibetans who were involved in that CIA program to check with the American government. And the CIA didn't want him coming because this was a secret operation. 1, 2, it maybe was not legal. 3, it was not so successful. So CIA didn't want him coming to America in case this information about this secret program came out. At the time, nobody knew about it. So my father-in-law wrote back and said, tell him if he wants a visa to America, we can easily get him one, but we have to get from our side. And don't tell anyone he's in the government about it until we have the visa, because otherwise CIA will block it. But once we have it, if CIA tries to block it, we will be able to see why, bring out why they wanted to block it. They'll be too shy to take that risk. So then he got his visa, and from May, and then Russia heard about it and said, well, quickly, you must come to Russia before you go to America. Like going, who will get to the moon first? Who will put the first man in space? It's a little bit like when America and Russia would play hockey. Who will win? Who will win? It'd be good if all wars were fought in that way. Who will win at hockey? Who will win at soccer? anyway, so from that time on, Dalai Lama started going quite regularly to Mongolia, Russia, America, and Europe, and so on. And then his books started coming out. And then as they came out and Buddhism started developing around the world, he thought maybe we should have some kind of classic series, because until then, people would just translate and publish mainly a lot by academics, what they chose to do for their PhD project. And so a lot of kind of obscure academic stuff, sort of a little bit like Stycz-Rybacki from Russia way back 125 years ago. Very valuable work, but not of interest to the general public, really much more for academics and for general people. And so then the idea Dalai Lama came up with was maybe we should have one, he would choose a dozen or 2 dozen books that would be a kind of basics. And so those are very good to read. But I think more important than those are books which are like Menga, oral transmission teachings of lamas. So Dalai Lama's own books on things like kindness, clarity, and insight, and compassion, ethics for the new millennium. These books of Dalai Lama talking in general. One problem with translation of classics is these are written not to be read as casual literature. Like no Tibetan buys a book and just takes it home and reads it like a detective novel or light reading. Usually when they study it, it says a Lama is reading, and each page he'll comment on for many, many hours. So some of those books in olden days, just one book, they would read it over, say, 7 years in monasteries. So they just do half a page a day, talking about it for 2 hours and then debating it for 5-6 hours. So sometimes when you just read it in a casual way, it's nice, but the meaning is not really deeply accessible. So more useful for an average person doing a general reading is, collections of Dalai Lama lectures and teachings about Lamrim and Lojong and various kind of human qualities, as he likes to call them, becoming better human being. We could say becoming an enlightened being is just becoming an optimally better human being, or becoming fully human, something like that. So those are very, very important. I'm sure you have many of them in Russia. I know Garchen Rinpoche goes there quite often, great Trikung Kagyu Lama. Probably some of his books are out. I don't know what else is of Dalai Lama books are there, but I'm sure you must have. In the West, we have 30 to 25, between 25 and 50. So I'm sure you must have 5 or 10 of them. But the best, I think, for ordinary reader are things written in for an ordinary educated audience who is not a specific intellectual studying a specific subject.
Thank you very much for this interview. And actually, it's been quite a long time already since you visited Russia. And unfortunately, nowadays we cannot travel freely because of this situation. All the borders are closed, but nonetheless, we remember you and we love you, and we are very grateful for you and to you. And could you please just to conclude this talk, this interview, could you please say a few words to your listeners in Russia, some congratulations on this occasion of the 6th July, the celebration of the birthday of His Holiness?
Sure. One of the texts I translated many years ago was for Dalai Lama's Kalachakra initiation in Switzerland in 1985. And it had a poem written for the enthronement of this Dalai Lama in 1939, written by Retting Rinpoche. So I'm going to just read a couple of little verses from that, if I may. I have to find them first, of course. Da, 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 da. Where did I put it? I'll look in the table of contents. Second, fourth, and the great thing. Oh yeah, I think I put it in with the 14th Dalai Lama. Yeah, actually, the first book I ever translated, first text, was with Dobum Toku, who became Dalai Lama's foreign secretary later. At the time, he was in charge of manuscript room, which is a long life prayer for Dalai Lama. And okay, here it is. In the great sky of compassion's pure nature. So this is written by Retting Rinpoche, previous Retting Rinpoche. As a young man, he had been made close disciple of 13th Dalai Lama. And people were not so happy when he was appointed regent because he was too young. He was very young, they thought. But he was a beautiful poet, great practitioner, great meditator. Great sky of compassion's pure nature appear clouds of unobscured wisdom and mercy. So in this vast sky, compassion and wisdom manifest like clouds. And they release a shower of immortality. So compassion and wisdom make a great cloud, rain cloud, with nectar. Droplets in the cloud is the nectar of healing and longevity. And they erect a pillar of undying diamond life. In other words, a Vajra life. So it's like compassion and wisdom manifest in the sky. Oh, Holy One. I think that's Dampa in Tibetan, if I recollect correctly. So holy in English is kind of a funny word, but the radiance of your merit and wisdom. In other words, the young boy is just bursting with good karma and with potential. And this, as a result of many eons of practice. So because of many lifetimes of practice, this comes out. And you overcame within yourself the darkness of the two obscurations. In other words, for practicing in many lifetimes, the darkness of the klesha, like ignorance, attachment, aversion, and so forth, and the kshetra, the obscurations to perceiving reality as it is. You overcame this, and now you will fill the world with the light of the twofold enlightenment activities. So now you're back as this little 4-year-old boy. And I prophesy you're going to fill the world with the light of the two Buddha karma. And one of those is benefiting all living beings. And the other is benefiting, lifting up, preserving the enlightenment tradition. So if we look at Dalai Lama's life, he's certainly done that. I remember once in England, he had a very tough interview on BBC by a program called Hard Talk, where they have on people who are celebrities and ask them very challenging, difficult, almost insulting questions. And Dalai Lama wasn't very used to that, because usually people treat him, very sort of gently, because he's a monk and he's sort of such a saintly being. And he said, well, true, if my work for Tibet independence and whatnot, if it's not working so well, then of course that's possible. Not everything one does will always work. But he said, at least I've been able to benefit humanitarian issues, which is, and secondly, he said, I've been able to benefit to eliminate some sort of religious tolerance or spiritual, in other words, benefiting Dharma. So I thought that was very cute. Then it goes through, you manifest it in India as a garland of these 26 incarnations. And then in Nepal and Tibet, there's 10 kings and 10 great masters. And then as early Dalai Lamas, you did this and that. So the Retting Rinpoche's poem very beautifully goes through kind of the life legends and whatnot of various Dalai Lamas, and down until what he expects for the present Dalai Lama. And so that in that way, we can see from the Dalai Lama's birth, great expectation was placed upon him. And he has, I think, very much lived up to the fulfillment of those prophecies and aspirations embodied in that poem by the great Retting Rinpoche. And in terms of this Dalai Lama, then of course, a little difficult for him now that he's in his mid-80s to travel and teach so much. And with COVID internationally, they're trying to keep him somewhat isolated because he's in the age group, which is a little bit more vulnerable. But it is wonderful to see his health and strength. They're still so great. He still gives initiations by Zoom and Dharma teachings by Zoom. And of course, receives people in his home in Dharamsala. But with the COVID outbreak for the last year and a half, obviously he's been limited in travel, but at his age, that might have been a benefit, who knows, because all those long distance flights and whatnot. So I think for those of us who are strong enthusiasts for the Enlightenment traditions, the Enlightenment tradition on the earth, we're now at the halfway point of the Buddhist legacy of 5,000 years of 10 500-year periods of spiritual unfoldment. And we're very lucky. This sixth 500-year period started in 1956. And at that year, the Dalai Lama visited India, Bodh Gaya, for a first time. And that really was to celebrate the 2,500th year of Buddha's passing, and the prophecy from Buddha, the 2,500 years after my passing, my Dharma will go to the land of the red man. And Tibetans think that means us white people, because whenever we drink a little vodka, our noses and faces get red. And whenever we get angry, our noses and faces get red. I can see Raman with 3 glasses of Beluga vodka shining like bright red, saying, I'm fulfilling the prophecy of the Buddha. Dharma is coming to Russia. Americans like to think it means America because they like to think the red man refers to red Indians, our First Nations over here. But anyway, 1956 began that period, and those of us in this period were sort of in the first phase of this early birth period of this 500-year phase. So the work we do is very important. The work Dalai Lama has done has been very important and will continue to be important in shaping how this 500 years will go. And as is said in Buddhism, everything's tentrel to jungwa. Everything is dependent origination. This arises from that. This arises from that. Cause and effect. Dalai Lama has done a good job. And if we all do good jobs, then the Enlightenment tradition will continue strong for the remainder of the 5,000-year prophecy. And in terms of on Dalai Lama's birthday, it's nice to light some candles or butter lamps or burn some incense. And if you can get a copy of Retting Rinpoche's prayer for the Dalai Lama and recite that, that's the best. Otherwise, in India, Ling Rinpoche and Trijun Rinpoche wrote a shorter one, which all Tibetans memorized. And perhaps one of you can make a translation of that. I can send you the English of it, but I don't have the Tibetan with me here in Canada. They're all on, probably available digitally in various forms around the world. But I think, yes, to send strong thoughts for long life of Dalai Lama and all of the great lamas, all the great beings, and that our own work, to remember everything we do is impacting the flow of this unfolding Buddhist saga. We are not mere witnesses to the 5,000-year prophecy. We are participants, and we are equally our role in shaping this unfolding enlightenment tradition is equally important, in the sense that, as the seventh Dalai Lama once put it in one of his poems, when you fill a bucket with water, if it's the first drop or a big bowl full in the middle, or the last drop that fills the bucket, we cannot say one is more important than the other. As Dalai Lama himself once put it, for this world to survive in a happy way over the next few generations, everyone has to do their best and drop their worst. So, of course, we all have some good and some bad in us, and we have some altruism and also some narcissism and so on. So to try to give full rein to our altruism and try to rein in a little bit our narcissism, something like that. Or as it's put in many of the Buddha's prayers, Gawa di Nyurdak Shenrazi Wang Shuk Yurne Do Chikyum Malopati Sala Kupar Show, Changes Samsho Rinpoche Makipana Kiguchi, Kipan Yampa Mepa Yonkone Kondu Power Show. Any kind of goodness that comes, good energy, good karma comes from anything we do, in that may each of us accomplish the state of an Avalokiteshvara, a Buddha of compassion. And in that way, bring benefit to every living being. And within ourselves, the two bodhicittas, although we may have some, and that's peerless, nonetheless, may our compassion and our wisdom grow from high to higher. Spasiba.